Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's web conference, Understanding How the HUBZone Maps Are Designated. Please note that all participant lines will be muted for the duration of this event. You are, however, welcome to submit written questions throughout the presentation, and these will be addressed after the conference. To submit a written question, select All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu of the chat panel located on the bottom right-hand side of your screen and send in your question. Should you require technical assistance, send a private note to the event producer or call our help desk at 1-888-796-6118. And with that, I'm going to now formally begin today's conference and introduce Ambuj Neopne, Program Analyst of the HUBZone program. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding How the HUBZone Maps Are Designated. My name is Ambuj Neopane. I am a program analyst here at the SBA working for the HUBZone program, and most of what I do on a day-to-day basis is work with the HUBZone maps and mapping issues. So just real quick before we get started going through the governing regulations for the HUBZone program, if you want to know more about the program in its entirety, not just related to the maps, you can refer to 13 CFR Part 126, which covers the HUBZone programs regulations, as well as FAR Subpart 19.13, which covers HUBZone contracting. Today we're going to be talking about just a general overview of the HUBZone map, what the map looks like today, what you're seeing when you look at the map. We're going to briefly discuss the National Defense Authorization Act for 2018 updates to the HUBZone maps and map designations. We're not going to cover those in detail, but we'll get there. Then we're going to go to the meat of our webinar today, which is talking about the different HUBZone map designations. This webinar is intended to take you through the process of understanding how each designation occurs on the HUBZone map in order to sort of understand how they all interplay with each other and how they all look on the map. There is a different webinar online at SBA's YouTube page if you want to understand exactly how the map interface itself works, rather than how all the data is processed, which is what today we'll cover. And then finally, we'll go through a review. We'll do a case studies where you can see how some of these designations play together, and we'll end with some additional resources. So off the bat, we're going to talk about the HUBZone Map Overview. In case you are not yet aware, the HUBZone map was modernized in June of 2017, replacing all previous versions. So this means that the old 90s style HUBZone map that had been used for the past several years is no longer in use. That map is out of date and should no longer be used. The current map can be viewed by going to the HUBZone Maps landing page at www.sba.gov/HUBZone-maps. That'll take you to SBA's site where you see the big blue button that says click here to see the map. And then when you do, you will be greeted with a map that looks something like this. This is more or less what you will see when you take a look at the HUBZone maps. If you see any other map that looks something that does not look like this, and it may be zoomed out to show the entire United States rather than just one particular section, if you see anything that does not look like this map, then you're at the wrong maps. Make sure you're at this one. You will know because on the URL it says maps.certified.sba.gov. You'll see that. So here's what you see when you take a look at the map. And I'm going to go through a quick overview of just how the map works. What you want to do is you want to start off by typing your address or your coordinates here. By coordinates, I mean your latitude and longitude. And when you do so and hit enter, you'll see a pinpointed search result with where you've typed in the address or your coordinates. And then a sidebar will also pop up. On that sidebar, you will see the address and coordinates displayed on the top of the sidebar. Immediately underneath, you will see the qualification status. if your qualification status has an expiration date, in other words, if it is anything besides a qualified Indian land, qualified non-metropolitan county, or qualified census tract, those are the three that do not have expiration dates. All other designations do. If it has an expiration date and the layer which is expiring is the layer on which your HUBZone designation is based off of, it will say qualified HUBZone until whatever the date is. And it'll give you the date under the qualified HUBZone within the green box. To go and take a look in depth at the designations, you go ahead and you'll see this designations piece right under the green box that shows whether or not you're qualified. Now these will show all the different applicable designations for your pinpointed search results. So as we can see here, we did a search for Indian Service Road, Route 492 in New Mexico, USA, and we found the map found the point, and it shows that that point has three designations associated with it: census tract, qualified census tract, qualified non-metropolitan county, and qualified Indian land. If you would like to see details about the qualified census tract or non-metropolitan county or Indian land, go ahead and click on Show Details on the right. That will tell you the tract number. It will tell you the county FIPS code, as well as the county name. It will also tell you the reservation or tribal land that the qualified Indian land is based off of. Going further down on the sidebar, you'll be able to see additional information. This local information here currently will show you the congressional district in which the point that you're looking at is located. So if you click on Show Details there, right now you'll be able to see the congressional district information. Close to the bottom, we have the Map PDF button as well as a Share Map button. The PDF version is currently what the HUBZone program requires for you to submit with your application documentation to verify that you are indeed in a HUBZone. So you create the PDF by just clicking on that printable version there. If you would like to share the particular view of the map that you're looking at with anybody, just go ahead and click on that Share Map, and it'll populate a URL which you can then copy and paste and send to whomever so that they can see the map that you are looking at. And then finally, on the bottom of the sidebar, you will see the date of qualification. Now, if you're looking at the map will always say qualification is valid for today, and then it'll list the date. If you go and click on the map PDF to create the printable version, the qualification date will be listed on the PDF. So you will know that the qualification is valid as of that day. The PDF qualification is also important in case you ever have cases where you need to defend your HUBZone qualification sometime in the future. It's very good for documentation purposes in those instances. For other additional information we have on the map to help assist you with using the map is right underneath the search bar, we have map viewing options. Now, you can view it in a light gray mode. You can view it in a standard, more Google Maps type view. And you can also use satellite view if you click on the drop-down menu there. And finally, on the bottom left-hand side, you have the legend. Map designations, in other words, all of the different qualifications that HUBZone has on the map can be toggled off or on. And what this means is when you go ahead and let's say you want to only look at qualified HUBZones rather than HUBZones that expire at some point. So you only want to look at qualified census tracts, qualified non-metropolitan counties, or qualified Indian lands. You would uncheck the redesignated areas, the qualified disaster areas, and as well as the qualified base closure areas. And those will no longer graphically show on the map. However, the sidebar, if you ever click on a point on the map, the sidebar will always populate every single available qualification for the point that you clicked on. It's just a way to graphically narrow down the areas that you may be looking at if you want to look at only one type of HUBZone designation or just a group. So that's basically it for the map. And so we'll go ahead and talk more about the NDAA 2018 updates. NDAA stands for National Defense Authorization Act for 2018. There are several changes that have been made for the HUBZone maps, and as a result, these events have occurred and will be occurring. So to begin with, qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties were updated with the latest data received prior to December 12, 2017. December 12, 2017 is the date on which the NDAA was signed by the President. So per our current regulations, we were to update the data with the latest data available, and so as a result, we updated all of the data with the latest data received prior to that date. As a result of the NDAA, areas that were listed as redesignated on December 12, 2017, regardless of when their redesignation expired, have had their redesignation period extended to December 31st, 2021, essentially enacting a quote-unquote freeze of the HUBZone map. Now, if you look at the statute, it does say 2020, but the interpretation behind it is meant to take a look at when the results of the 2020 census are released, which SBA estimates to be the 2020 census results will be released by December 31st, 2021, and will be analyzed then, and we will be able to have new maps. And the reason the 2020 census is so important is because it redraws the map of the U.S. So basically, when you look at qualified census tracts, counties, all of that information that the census takes into account, the census is a big portion of when the maps get redrawn to account for changes that have happened in the last decade. So as a result, we're extending the redesignation for all of these areas until December 31st, 2021. Furthermore, existing HUBZone areas, including qualified census tracts, qualified non-metropolitan counties, and redesignated areas, will maintain their designations until December 31st, 2021. Now, basically what that means is the maps are currently more or less frozen until that date. It's important to note that if an area is listed as redesignated today, those redesignated areas will expire on December 31st, 2021, unless they are requalified by the 2020 census or they have some other sort of applicable designation on top of the redesignated status. And going back to the map here real quick, what I mean by having other designations on top is, as you can see here on the right-hand side with the applicable designations, there are several designations that can overlap with each other. So if there's an overlapping designation that overrides the December 31st, 2021 date, then you're okay. But if you're only based off of the redesignation and that's set to expire on December 31st, 2021, be aware that that expiration will occur unless requalified by the 2020 census. And then finally, other HUBZone updates, for example, the governor-designated covered areas, which is a new designation set to take place, and changes to the definitions of currently existing qualified areas. There are some changes, for those of you who may not know, there are some changes that are made to how qualified non-metropolitan counties are designated, for example. Those changes will take effect no earlier than 2020. So in this particular webinar, we will not be discussing them to a great extent. Just be aware that these changes that are currently written out in the law are set to take effect no earlier than 2020. As for right now, what we have is a quote-unquote frozen map that maintains the designation, the current designations, until at least December 31st, 2021. So that's more or less what the NDAA 2018 has done for the current version of the HUBZone map. I'm leaving aside all of the conversations that the NDAA 2018 has on the rest of the HUBZone program and focusing just on the map in this webinar. So we'll go to the meat of our conversation today, where we're talking about the different HUBZone map designations. Now, there are 6 different HUBZone designations. An address that is located within any of these designations is in an eligible HUBZone area. The 6 designations are Qualified Census Tract, Qualified Non-Metropolitan County, Qualified Indian Land, Redesignated Areas, Qualified Base Closure Area, and Qualified Disaster Area. As I say, these are the 6 current designations that we have on. And again, in 2020, we will be adding another one called Governor Designated Covered Areas, and that has a whole set of rules and regulations that we're not going to be talking about today. Here is what the designation workflow looks like. And it's going to be a little bit complicated to explain, but we'll go back to this in the review so that you will hopefully have a better understanding. Imagine the HUBZone, just a base map of the United States without anything related to HUBZone, just whatever the base map is. The base map, as it stands, would be not qualified. There are no HUBZone designations on top of the base map. Now, from that, you can have qualified census tracts that are put on top of that, qualified Indian lands, qualified non-metropolitan counties. And I'll talk about base closure areas in a second, but let's focus on those 3 for now. Qualified Indian lands, they're a layer there, and once they're designated, they generally permanently stay there. Qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties are there as a foundation. When the economic situation of a qualified census tract or a qualified non-metropolitan county improves, it may no longer meet the thresholds to be considered a HUBZone area anymore. In those cases, those formerly qualified areas become redesignated. And what redesignated means is that although the area is no longer considered qualified, there is a grace period of 3 years in which firms have the ability to move resources as they will, to either move to a different HUBZone or decide what they're going to do with their status. And so the redesignation designation is intended to give firms that grace period to say, look, this used to be a qualified census tract, or this used to be a qualified non-metropolitan county. It no longer meets the thresholds, so it has become redesignated because the economic situation has improved. Once redesignated, post-redesignation, there are 3 possible options. The tract or county can go from redesignated to not qualified. When the 3-year redesignation period expires, it can go to not qualified. Or, and here's where we'll talk about base closure areas. The reason why base closure areas are either concurrent during the redesignation period or when it's considered not qualified is because base closure areas can occur on the map anywhere except for areas that are otherwise qualified. So in other words, if a base closure occurs in an area that has a qualified census tract or qualified non-metropolitan county, it cannot also be considered as a qualified base closure area. And we'll go in depth on how that all works in a bit. But what that means is that base closure areas can only come from areas that formerly were not qualified or for anything, or areas that are currently redesignated. A redesignation and a base closure area can occur concurrently. The other option is qualified disaster area. The way that the logic for qualified disaster areas work now is that if a disaster occurs and the qualified disaster area conditions are met, the area, either the census tract or the non-metropolitan county, is allowed to run through its entire redesignation period, so run through all of the 3 years of redesignation before it becomes a qualified disaster area. If it goes from redesignated to qualified, as in a county moves from qualified non-metropolitan county to redesignated, back to qualified non-metropolitan county, the qualified disaster area designation will run concurrently with the qualified non-metropolitan county designation. Otherwise, if it goes from redesignated to not qualified, but it is eligible for qualified disaster area designations, then once the redesignation period expires, the 5 or 10 years of qualified disaster area designation will begin. And again, it gets very into the weeds and complicated, so there's a case study at the end that sort of analyzes this. And that's the basic designation workflow of how the HUBZone maps work. So we'll go into in depth for each of these designations, and we'll start off with qualified census tracts. Qualified census tracts, how are they designated? Well, the Department of Housing and Urban Development determines QCTs, is what we call them. If they make any changes to how QCTs are designated, those changes are listed in HUD's Federal Register Notice. They release a Federal Register Notice every year with the release of every QCT series for the year. And so you'll be able to find it at the link down below. Now, to be qualified as a qualified census tract, a census tract must have either a poverty rate of at least 25% or 50% or more of its householders must have incomes below 60% of the area median household income. The area will correspond to a metropolitan or non-metropolitan area. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying that it doesn't matter whether the area is metropolitan or not. And then furthermore, the other limitation is that no more than 20% of the metropolitan area population can reside within designated qualified census tracts. This limit also applies collectively to non-metropolitan areas in each state. For the HUBZone program specifically, now this is where SBA separates from HUD. This 20% population limit does not apply to Puerto Rico. So in the case of Puerto Rico, what SBA does is SBA takes HUD's formula and the data that HUD releases and works through the formula to discover the poverty rate as well as the median household income rate, but does not apply the 20% population cap. If you want to understand the exact steps that are taken to determine the data and the designations, all of that data is available at the HUD QCT data portal, and there's a link down below here. At the end of the webinar, at the end of the HUBZone webinar series, SBA will publish all of these presentations in a PDF format so that you are able to access these links. But for now, let me just quickly click on that just to show you all what it looks like. So this is the Housing and Urban Development page that that shows qualified census tracts. This is what the view was for the 2018 census tracts. Now, if you want to see the first thing you would want to do is read the Federal Register Notice to see if there are any changes. That is this first link here, statutorily mandated designation of difficult development areas and qualified census tracts. If you want to see the actual data, you would go ahead and click on this Generate QCT Tables. If you want to see the data across the United States, there are some links here that say Excel spreadsheets containing the data used to designate the 2018 QCTs are available here. You click on that, you can follow the procedures to get there. If you want to read the algorithm to understand how they got to the data, you can click on the designation algorithm here, and it goes through step-by-step how to compute that particular data. Now, recall, SBA does not have control over the qualified census tract data. All SBA does is take that information from HUD and parse it onto the map. The only exception, the only time when SBA differs from HUD is when, in the case of Puerto Rico, because we removed the 20% population cap. We're required by law to do so. So, as I was saying, here's the process for determining QCTs. You visit the HUD QCT generator, which is this page that we just saw. It has the Excel spreadsheets using the data designations. You will download the Excel spreadsheets which contain the QCT data. It's a fairly large download, so it's usually around 90 to 100 megabytes, and it's usually stored in a zip file. So you will want to download that. Then what you do is you validate the downloaded data by comparing the tract IDs and county FIPS codes to previous updates. So you take the qualified census tract list for 2018 and take a look at the qualified census tract list for 2017. On the Excel spreadsheet, all of the census tracts across the United States are listed, regardless of whether or not they're qualified. So what you are looking for here is you want to make sure that the number of counties in the data remain the same and the number of tracts within the data remain the same, just as a sanity check, because sometimes county names can change, right? Or some other occurrence can happen where perhaps the tract codes or the tracts and the counties do not appear to be the same somehow. It's a really good way to provide a sanity check as just to make sure that you're looking at accurate and consistent data. You also want to ensure that the metropolitan or non-metropolitan status of the tract is accurate. You do that. In the data, there is a field for that where you see 0 or 1 is the area metropolitan or not, 0 being no, 1 being yes. And you do that in order to make sure that, again, another sanity check against the data. And the reason why this is important is because OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, publishes on occasion a new list of metropolitan areas across the United States. They use it. They say it's to be used for statistical purposes only. Usually 3 or 4 years after they publish it, data sets begin showcasing the new metropolitan or non-metropolitan status of a particular area within their own data. So it's important that the data set used to determine metropolitan or non-metropolitan areas is consistent between what HUD has, between what Housing and Urban Development has, and what SBA has. Ensuring that those metropolitan areas are consistent really helps with understanding which areas can be qualified. So once you're done with all of these sanity checks, you want to, the rest of it is pretty easy because on the HUD spreadsheet where you can download all the qualified data, the very last column contains a marker for a qualified census tract, 1 for yes, 0 for no. Well, then all you have to do is you just pick out all the ones that have 1, and those are your qualified census tracts as determined for the year. Again, there's the exception with Puerto Rico, but in the case of Puerto Rico, what you do, if you were concerned about specific to Puerto Rico, all you would do is when you look at the designation algorithm, go through steps 1 through 4 and ignore 5 through 9. Okay, 1 through 4 will give you all of the information you need to know, and all of this data is available within the Excel spreadsheets that HUD provides. 1 through 4 will take you to the point where you determine the poverty rate and the median household income rate. 5 through 9 determines that 20% population cap. So if you just don't do 5 through 9, you've effectively ignored the population cap limit. So if you're interested in how to do it for Puerto Rico, that's how you do that. So once you have the HUD status for whether or not a census tract is a QCT, then you'll need to compare the list of the current year census tracts, which I'm calling year N here, with prior year census tracts, which is year N-1 for each tract. And And you do that, and you just say if n is equal to n minus 1, don't change the status, because what that is telling you is that whatever the status is, qualified or not, of the census tract previously is the same. If it remains not qualified, then you will see a 0. If it remains qualified, you will see a 1. Now, if n does not equal n minus 1, then you have to determine the new status. Is it going from not qualified to qualified? Is it going from qualified to redesignated? It only goes from qualified to redesignated if it was qualified in the prior year tract and it is no longer qualified in the current year tract. Is it going from redesignated to not qualified? In other words, does the prior year information show that it has a redesignation that's expiring in the current year? Or is it going from redesignated to qualified? Sometimes an area can go from redesignated, in which it hadn't been qualified by a prior year, and move to being qualified because current year data qualified it. So you have to look at all of those different permutations to decide the future year status. Now, mind you, this can't bear enough repeating. All of this is frozen until December 31st, 2021. But if you are interested in looking back at previous years and looking at previous data, this would be very interesting for you to use. And it's just another way so that you understand how all of this qualification works. And that's basically it for qualified census tracts. The gist of it, if I was too in the weeds, the gist of it is you go to HUD's website, you download their data, you see whether or not HUD says an area is qualified or not, and then you compare it against SBA previous year data. The difference, just the only other thing you need to do is make sure that you do a sanity check on number of tracts, number of counties, as well as number of metropolitan areas to non-metropolitan areas, just as a way of making sure that your data is valid and correct. So let's move on to qualified non-metropolitan counties. We call them QNMCs. QNMCs can be qualified in 3 different ways. To be qualified, a non-metropolitan county must have one of these options here. It must have either A, median household income that is less than 80% of the non-metropolitan state median household income. In other words, the median household income takes a look against non-metropolitan counties across the state. Or the unemployment rate needs to be greater than or equal to 140% of the average U.S. or state unemployment rate for the United States, whichever is greater. So the non-metropolitan county's unemployment rate is judged against the U.S. and state unemployment rate. And if either the U.S. or the state unemployment rate ratio to the non-metropolitan county is greater than or equal to 140%, then that area would be considered qualified via unemployment. The third option does not apply to the majority of the United States, but anywhere outside of the 48 states, an area a non-metropolitan county can be considered a difficult development area. Difficult development areas are designated, again, by Housing and Urban Development. And difficult development areas, for the case of HUBZone, we only look at difficult development areas and qualify them if they are located within Alaska, Hawaii, or territory or possession of the United States outside of the 48 states. Now, this means Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, American Samoa, Guam, et cetera, et cetera. HUD gives us that data, and HUD does difficult development areas across the U.S. But again, for HUBZone purposes, for qualified non-metropolitan county, we only consider areas for DDA qualification if they are located outside of the 48 states. So we're going to take a look at each one of these qualifications and how to get there. Before we do so, So qualified non-metropolitan counties, they are updated 2 or 3 times a year. And changes to data, if there are any, are listed in Federal Register notices. Here I'm going to talk quickly about where the source of all of this data is, and then we're going to go into exactly how SBA analyzes the data sources. So difficult development areas, as I just mentioned, that data is gathered from Housing and Urban Development. It is released together with the qualified census tract data around September or October of every year. That website, the HUD QCT data portal, will also lead you to the DDAs. And if I switch back here for a quick second, this is the portal. If you look for 2018, you will see this is the qualified census tract tables. It also includes here DDA information. That's how you can find that. Or you can take a look at the PDFs that are listed down here. The median household income is gathered from the American Community Survey 5-year estimates that are released from the Census Bureau. That is released around December every year. And then finally, unemployment data is gathered from the Bureau of Labor Statistics under the Department of Labor, and that data is released around April or May of every year. Usually, HUBZone will update the American Community Survey and the difficult development area based HUBZone data together. And that's because although the DDA data is released around September, October of every year, it is effective as of January of the following year. So in other words, if we were to do a map update in January, we are not, but if we were to, then we would take the data that comes out from this September or October for American Community Survey, or for difficult development area data, and then in December we would take the American Community Survey data, and then we would analyze both the DDA and the ACS data, and then publish that as one update around January. Because BLS unemployment data is released around April and May, that's usually a separate update. And that's why qualified non-metropolitan counties are updated 2 or 3 times a year. It's updated at least twice, one update containing the American Community Survey and the difficult development area-based HUBZone data, and the other containing the unemployment data. On rare occasions, the American Community Survey median household income data and the DDA data may be separate updates, but usually they are rolled up in the same update. So because of all these different types of qualifications, there are several qualified non-metropolitan county qualifications. You can be qualified by income, you can be qualified by unemployment, you can be qualified by DDA, you can be qualified by any one of the 3 combinations, income and unemployment, income and DDA, unemployment and DDA, or income, unemployment, and DDA. You can also be redesignated until whatever month and year that you're redesignated. You can be non-qualified as a non-metropolitan area, or you can be not qualified as a metropolitan county. Metropolitan counties will never be qualified. Non-metropolitan counties, should the economic factors be such that they meet the HUBZone thresholds, can become qualified. So we've gone over this a little bit, but just so we go step by step into the process of understanding DDAs. Here's how you determine qualified non-metro counties by DDA status. You visit the HUD DDA table generator. We've already visited this link to obtain the latest list of DDAs. You want to generate a county-based DDA table. And then you compare the list of currently updated qualified non-metropolitan counties with the prior year, the same process that we did for qualified census tracts. If the status for the current year is the same as the prior year, do not change status. If the status is not the same as the prior year, determine the new status, whether it's qualified, redesignated, or not qualified. And it's important to note that a county can be qualified by income and unemployment as well as DDA. So counties will only become redesignated if none of those different types of qualifications are met. So you can lose your unemployment qualification, you can lose your DDA qualification, but you will still be qualified if you're qualified by income or any permutation of that. You only become redesignated if all of the different permutations of income, unemployment, and DDA are if none of those thresholds are met, and you were previously qualified, then you would become redesignated. If those qualifications were never met, then you would be not qualified, or if they were met greater than a time past which you would be redesignated. Moving on to the median household income update. Here's the process. You visit the Census American Fact Finder tool and download 2 files from table B19013. That is the ACS 5-year estimates table. You want to download ACS 5-year estimates for median household income by county, and then you want to download ACS 5-year estimates for non-metropolitan state median household income. Both of those are filter choices that you can filter through and take a look at on the Fact Finder tool. Now, just a quick note here, based off of the 2018 NDAA, one of the changes that were made was in the calculation of how median household income for non-metropolitan counties is calculated. They say now that the calculation for non-metropolitan state median household income will change to include metropolitan state median household income, theoretically opening up more areas to be hub zones, because generally speaking, metropolitan areas have higher income than non-metropolitan areas. So if you include metropolitan area income as the ratio against which you're looking for hub zones, there will be fewer non-metropolitan areas that meet that qualification, and thus there will be more hub zones. Again, you validate downloaded data by comparing county FIPS to previous updates. You ensure the metropolitan, non-metropolitan status is accurate. I explained that before with qualified census tracts, same process. And then you divide the county income by the state income to get the income ratio. Do not use margins of error. There is no provision in the regulations that allow for margins of error, so we go with what they say. And what by they, I mean the American Community Survey. If the non-metropolitan county or state, if the non-metropolitan county to state income ratio is less than 0.8, the county will be qualified. And then you compare the list of current update qualified non-metropolitan counties, as in year end, with previous year, and you go through the same process. If the current update is equal to the previous update, then don't change the status because nothing has changed. Otherwise, determine a new status. And then the same note here about the county can only be redesignated if and when it loses income, unemployment, and DDA qualification. If it doesn't apply to either of those three and it was previously qualified, that's when it can be redesignated. And then finally, we'll look at the qualified non-metropolitan county unemployment update. In order to do that, you would visit the Bureau of Labor Statistics local area unemployment statistics webpage and download these data tables. You want to download the annual state unemployment averages for the current year as well as the prior 2 years. You want to do the same for the county current year and prior 2 years, and the current U.S. unemployment average as well as the average over the prior 2 years. Again, validate the downloaded data against previous updates by making sure that there is no changed county name or new county or some combination of that, and ensure that the metropolitan and non-metropolitan status is accurate. Then what you do is you divide the county unemployment average by the state average, and you also divide the same county unemployment average by the U.S. average to get the unemployment ratio. If the non-metropolitan county to state ratio or to the U.S. ratio is greater than or equal to 1.4, in other words, 140%, the county is qualified. Now, unemployment data is interesting because the Bureau of Labor Statistics, year by year, usually revises the previous 5 years of unemployment data. So That's why we repeat this process for the current year, the previous year, and 2 years ago, because we really go 2 years back when we take a look at areas that could be potentially up for redesignation. Now, so what this means in practice is that, let's say it's 2018, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2018 decided that the unemployment data in 2016 was such that the ratio where for a particular county where previously was not qualified is now currently qualified, or should have been qualified back in 2015. We do have cases like that. They're very rare, but they do come up on occasion. And if that does occur, then we have a series of steps where we say, okay, an area, we're in 2018, and then we see that the data in 2015 says that an area should have been qualified but wasn't. What we generally do then is we take a look at the year afterwards. Was it still qualified for 2017? If so, then there's a whole process that we follow there. If it was qualified for the 1 year only, then we should have given them a year of qualification. We didn't then, so we're going to add a year of qualification for them and redesignate them until such time as their designation is set. If you are interested in particular permutations of this, if you see this come up when you try and do your own data, please email us, and somebody over at the HUBZone program can send you the table that contains all of the different permutations of what you need to look at to understand unemployment revision data. That's a bit too in the weeds for this particular webinar, so we're gonna gloss over that a little bit. At most, it applies to a county or two over the course of the day. And as the maps are frozen, it's not as important to consider now. So here's once you have that data, you compare the list of the current update qualified non-metropolitan counties with the prior update. Now, with current update and prior update, this used to mean that in June or July, you were looking at qualified non-metropolitan counties, and you would compare it against the January update that was made that included median household income data as well as difficult development area data. And that's why I say current update instead of current year versus prior year, because these updates happen more frequently than every year. And then the same process, if the current update is equal to the previous update, don't change the status, otherwise determine what the new status is. And then finally, as I was saying, with the prior year unemployment average updates, if there are any issues that popped up where 3 years ago the data said that an area was not qualified, but currently the current update says that 3 years ago actually the data should have been qualified, then you reconcile those changes. Redesignation years may be added if a county was not qualified for previous years. Basically what I went through. And again, if you see an issue like that occurring, they're very rare, they do happen on occasion, then please email hubzone@sba.gov, and one of us can send you the table that describes exactly how to work with each permutation of this. So moving on from qualified non-metropolitan counties, it's one of the more complicated updates, that one. We'll go to qualified Indian lands, which is one of the easier ones in terms of understanding it. Qualified Indian lands are simply this. They are determined when a reservation is federally recognized. When the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, that decides that an area is a federally recognized tribal area, then we take these into consideration. Areas within reservation boundaries that are provided by the Department of the Interior, in other words, they will provide us with essentially a polygon that shows the boundaries of the tribal area. That polygon will become the new qualified Indian land. If there are any trust lands that are outside of the reservation boundaries, those are handled on a case-by-case basis, determining, and basically what determines that is we take a look at the regulation for every case and see where it fits on that. Once a qualified Indian land is determined, it will retain its HUB zone status. There is no expiration date for it. And there is nothing currently in the regulations that say, you know, if it doesn't meet a certain threshold, then it changes to a redesignated area and therefore will expire eventually. It's just when a qualified Indian land is determined, it will retain HUB zone status. Then we move to redesignated areas. Qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties can become redesignated when their economic situation improves, essentially sunsetting the formerly qualified areas. The redesignation expires 3 years after the date on which the census tract or non-metropolitan county ceased to be qualified. So if a non-metropolitan county expired in January, well, let's say January 2014, if it was no longer considered qualified non-metropolitan county in January 2014, it would have become redesignated, and the redesignation would have stayed until January 2017. Redesignation, the changing from an area from being qualified to redesignated will affect the BRAC and qualified disaster area statuses. By BRAC, I mean base closure area. And then, again, as of the signing of the most recent National Defense Authorization Act, all the redesignated areas were extended to December 2021. So that's basically redesignated areas. Moving to qualified base closure areas. We call them BRACs here. I know BRAC has a different term for Department of Defense, but for SBA HUBZone purposes, when we're talking about HUBZone BRACs, we use the terminology BRAC. BRACs are determined when the Department of Defense notifies SBA of a base closure. A BRAC includes the lands within the boundaries of a military installation that was closed under privatization process under the proper authority, that, you know, basically it was properly privatized, the base boundaries, so wherever the base is located inside of those boundaries. The census tract or non-metropolitan county in which the base closure area is wholly contained. In other words, if the base is completely within a census tract or non-metropolitan county, it is considered to be within that area. A census tract or non-metropolitan county on the boundaries of which intersect the boundaries of a base closure area. So if a base closure area is in between 2 or 3 boundaries, you would be considering both boundaries as intersected. And then finally, a census tract or non-metropolitan county or the boundaries of which are contiguous to the boundaries of the base closure area. So, long story short, this basically means that a non-metropolitan county or a census tract that either contain a base, intersect a base, or are contiguous to the county or census tract which contain the base are considered part of the base closure area. Qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties are excluded from BRAC qualification as they are already qualified. So all of this is essentially to say that the boundaries of a base are very, very, very important. We need the actual shape of where the base is located to determine which tracts or counties are applied to the qualification. And we get those from Department of Defense. As of today, base closure areas include bases closed from 2005 to the current day. Bases expire after 8 years or with the analysis of the 2020 census, whichever is later. So essentially, bases closed between 2005 and 2012, it is, I believe, their future status will be determined with the results of the 2020 census. 2013 forward, 8 years is beyond the results of the 2020 census, so they have 8 years. The 8-year period is dependent on their closure date. All BRACs, this is what I just said, all BRACs between 2005 and 2012 are set to expire for the 2020 census results are released. We're estimating, again, December 2021. 2013 BRAC to present BRACs are set to expire in 8 years. Beginning in 2020, this is another National Defense Authorization Act change. It will change the expiration to 8 years only, with SBA determining the start date of the closure. That's a change. And then we have qualified disaster areas. Qualified disaster areas, to be considered qualified disaster areas, you must meet these conditions. You have to be a presidentially declared major disaster, a presidentially declared major disaster declaration or catastrophic incident must be issued. So major disaster declaration or catastrophic incident. And then individual assistance funding must be approved within that disaster declaration. That doesn't, just because those things happen, it doesn't mean that it's automatically qualified disaster area. Qualified disaster areas are only applied to non-metropolitan counties or census tracts that became redesignated areas within the 5 years leading up to the disaster, or they will become redesignated areas within 2 years following a disaster. And we can't predict the future. We don't know what the future data holds. So we have to, every time we do a census tract or non-metropolitan county update, we have to go back and we have to take a look at disasters that happened in prior years to see if this 2-year provision is being met. Once you determine the qualified disaster area qualification, the following logic applies. Qualified disaster areas, they're based off of qualified disaster area designations that are based off of major disaster declarations will receive 5 years of qualified disaster area designation. Currently, these are all of the qualified disaster areas on the map. Qualified disaster areas that are based off of catastrophic incidents will receive 10 years of qualified disaster area designation. There are currently no cases of that. And again, this information, the presidentially declared major disasters, is gathered from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and they are the ones that process these presidential disaster declarations. Once you understand the 5- and 10-year gap, and again, it's all 5 years currently. Currently, redesignated areas will complete their redesignation time period before beginning their qualified disaster area period. So this is what I was talking about in the beginning. SBA allows the redesignation period to carry through to the end of the redesignation. And the end of the redesignation is defined as if it regains qualified status, it's no longer redesignated, or if the redesignation expires. The qualified disaster area clock, the 5-year start time, begins at the end of the redesignation period. So this applies to areas that used to be qualified census tracts or qualified non-metropolitan counties, or became redesignated within a 2-year period following the disaster. So in other words, if a disaster occurs and then it occurs on a qualified non-metropolitan county, a qualified non-metropolitan county is not eligible to receive qualified disaster designation. But if the qualified non-metropolitan county becomes redesignated within 2 years following the disaster, then it will the qualified disaster area designation will apply once the redesignation period runs through, or if it becomes qualified again, the qualified disaster area designation will run concurrently. Beginning in previously redesignated areas began their qualified disaster area period as of the disaster declaration date. And what that means is when you go back and you take a look at the qualified disaster area designation, one of the qualifiers is it must have become redesignated 5 years, at least 5 years before the disaster date. Well, redesignations only last for 3 years, so if a redesignation began 5 years ago, it would have been 2 years of just not being qualified. But when we go back and look at the data, we take the year in which it began its redesignation into consideration, And even if it was not qualified to for 2 years, if the disaster happens, then the qualified disaster area period begins on the disaster declaration date, and the 5-year clock starts then, or 10-year clock if applicable. And then beginning in 2020, SBA will no longer consider qualified disaster areas for areas which become redesignated within 2 years following the disaster declaration date. This is another NDAA 2018 change. So in other words, that future provision where you go back and you look at qualified areas or you look at old disasters, we will no longer be considering that 2-year forward period. We'll just be looking at the 5 years back from the disaster declaration date. Here's the qualified disaster area process. I know it can get very confusing with understanding qualified disaster areas, but again, there will be a quick case study on this. The QDA process. First, you receive the monthly disaster declaration data with individual assistance. SBA will receive it from the Office of Disaster Assistance, which is within SBA. The Office of Disaster Assistance is just the easiest avenue for SBA to use internally between offices, because they already have a connection and already aggregate the data directly from FEMA. And of course, FEMA is the one that monitors all these disaster declarations. So we receive the data. Then we determine the QDA eligibility for counties listed in the data, including eligibility from previous declarations. So this is in reference to the 2-year forward period. Every month we go ahead and we take a look at the data and we see if new disasters cause new qualified disaster areas, or if old disasters have changed the status of a current qualified non-metropolitan county or census tract. So here's where I say non-metropolitan counties and census tracts within declared counties can receive QDA status if the redesignation criteria is met the 5 years before to 2 years after. Qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties cannot be qualified disaster areas because they are already qualified. And then qualified disaster area status begins when the redesignation expires, or immediately if the redesignation has already expired, just to sort of simplify that whole process. And that's it for the HUBZone designation. So I'll go, because it gets very in the weeds and deep, I'll go through a quick review here. We talked about how there are 6 different HUBZone designations: qualified census tract, qualified non-metro county, qualified Indian land, redesignated areas, qualified base closure areas, and qualified disaster areas. The first 3, census tract, non-metro county, and Indian lands, do not have expiration dates. However, qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties can no longer meet qualification thresholds, turning them into redesignated areas. Redesignated areas, qualified base closure areas, and qualified disaster areas all have expiration dates. Any one of these qualifications renders you as an eligible HUBZone area, and if you have multiple qualifications on a particular address that you are looking at, then the map logic will consider if one of the top 3 qualifications are available, and then if not, and it would consider one of the top 3 because those would be perpetual qualifications. If one of the top 3 are not available, then it will say qualified HUBZone until the last applicable date where it would make eligibility. Again, here's the designation workflow. The base map of the United States, not qualified. Then we go through and we do our analysis. We find that at the base level there are qualified census tracts, qualified non-metropolitan counties, or qualified Indian lands. Or if a base is closed and the area in which the base is closed is not a qualified census tract or a qualified non-metropolitan county, it can be a qualified base closure area. Then we move forward in time, and some of these qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties become redesignated. At that time, the date that it became redesignated will matter for qualified disaster areas. And when it's redesignated, it's no longer qualified, so base closure areas can also be put on redesignated areas, and those run concurrently. And then finally, the simplest way to move forward is if you go from not qualified to being a qualified county or tract to being redesignated, and then again to not being qualified anymore. Theoretically, the economic situation of your county or tract has improved. Because this can get very confusing, there are several common misunderstandings that hopefully we can try and clear up. Qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties do not have expiration dates. Future data may result in the loss of qualified census tract or non-metropolitan county status. When that future data says that these tracts or counties no longer meet the threshold, they turn into redesignated areas. BRAC designations can be placed on not qualified areas or redesignated non-metropolitan counties or census tracts. Redesignations and BRAC status operate concurrently. The only areas where BRAC designations cannot be put on top of is if the area is already a qualified area. In other words, already a qualified census tract or qualified non-metropolitan county. Qualified disaster area and BRAC statuses can operate concurrently because both of them require, qualified disaster area requires an area to have been previously redesignated, and a BRAC status only requires that an area is not qualified. So an area can be a BRAC and a QDA at the same time, provided that the area used to be qualified and has achieved redesignation. Qualified census tracts and qualified non-metropolitan counties cannot become BRACs or QDAs. This is important. If it's a qualified census tract or a qualified non-metropolitan county, for the boundaries of that tract or county, the only options that are available for that county are to be qualified census tracts or non-metropolitan counties. It can also be qualified Indian lands, but they cannot become BRACs or QDAs unless they become redesignated. Areas that appear to be not qualified on the map as it is today can become qualified disaster areas if they began their redesignation up to 5 years before the disaster declaration date. And this is because redesignations expire in 3 years. So there may be possibly a 2-year gap in which an area shows up as not qualified before becoming a qualified disaster area. And finally, presidentially declared major disaster declarations do not automatically grant qualified disaster area status for affected counties. It is easiest for me to think of qualified disaster areas as specific to saying an area used to be a HUB zone, and the economic situation improved. It no longer was a qualified census tract or qualified non-metropolitan county, so it became redesignated. But then a disaster hits, or a disaster recently hit, and as a result, that area that just had its economic situation improved will need some extra help, and that's where the qualified disaster area status comes in. It's specific to those areas that were recently HUB zone qualified, either through tract or county status, and their economic situation improved, so they were no longer qualified, but will have that 3-year grace period. But then the disaster hit, and as a result, we allow them to become qualified again to essentially help them recover from the disaster. It does not apply to any area that has, to all areas that have received disaster declarations. Very, very specific designation. And just real quick, I'm going to go through the map designations again. Like I was saying, here's the qualification status. If there is an expiration date, it'll say qualified HUB zone until whatever the date is. The applicable designations are here. For this particular screenshot, you can see 3 different designations that are applicable that are all overlapping on this one point. You will see the date of qualification, and you can see the types of qualifications here. Even if you uncheck one of these types of qualifications, all of the different designations will show up on the sidebar. So before we sort of close this out, I want to go through a quick case study to show you how some of these different designations play together. And the important thing to take away from this entire webinar is to understand that the dates matter. Dates for HUBZone designation and qualification matter. And understanding when an area is a HUBZone is very important. So we'll take, for example, Georgetown County in South Carolina. Now, Georgetown County in South Carolina, they lost HUBZone eligibility on October 1st, 2011. So here's the status of events that have happened since then. Between October 1st, 2011 and June 30th, 2015, they were listed as not qualified. On July 1st, 2015, they became redesignated until July 2018 because of revised unemployment data. And remember, qualified non-metropolitan counties by unemployment updates, you can have the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes back and revises data, and so that redesignation was one of those rare cases where the data was revised, and so because it should have been qualified in a previous year but wasn't, we redesignated it. And then on July 1st, 2016, it became qualified due to new unemployment data. So that's new information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. On October 14th, 2016, a disaster was declared for Georgetown County. Again, this doesn't mean that it received qualified disaster area status, it's just a disaster was declared. And according to the data at this point, if you look at the dates here, it was a qualified non-metropolitan county as of the date of the disaster. So if that status had carried forward for the full 2 years, it never would have gotten qualified disaster area designation. But on July 1st, 2017, it became redesignated until July 2020 due to new unemployment data. So this is a county that just is above or below the 140% unemployment threshold. You know, it's just rocking back and forth, and so as a result, its HUBZone status is rocking back and forth as well. But so on December 12, 2017, the NDAA was signed, and so as a result, the redesignation period, which was set to expire on July 2020, it was extended until December 31st, 2021. So what does this all mean? Well, there's a potential qualified disaster area in all of this, and you'll see how it works. Now, barring any future changes, I don't know what the future brings, so this could change something, but here is what is scheduled to happen if nothing changes. On January 1st, 2022, that redesignation period that was extended until December 31st, 2021 will expire, and qualified disaster area designation will begin. As we said, we let the redesignation period run through its course before we begin the 5 years of qualified disaster area. Now, it will begin because of Hurricane Matthew, when the disaster was declared on October 14, 2016. But the reason why the designation was not applicable on October 14, 2016 was because the county was qualified on that date. It became redesignated on July 1st, 2017, which was less than 2 years forward. So, in other words, it was between October 14, 2016 and October 14, 2018. Because July 1st, 2017 is between those two dates, it met the 2 years after disaster date provision. But it was redesignated. And as we say, we allowed the redesignation to carry through, and the redesignation was extended. So all of that kind of plays together to say that on January 1st, 2022, the redesignation period expires, but the qualified disaster area provision begins. And then finally, 5 years after January 1st, 2022, on January 1st, 2027, the qualified disaster area expires. The county at that point will become not qualified. So it's just a quick way to show how these different designations can interplay with each other and extend or look back at different designations. And that is why we say it's very, very, very important to make sure that your area is qualified. And that is also why the most recent National Defense Authorization Act is such a boon, because as I said in the very beginning of this webinar, the map will be updated every 5 years beginning in 2021. And so you won't have so much of this back and forth issue like how we had with Georgetown County in determining qualification. It'll be much, much easier to see if an area will be qualified or not, and that qualification will be stable across the 5-year time period. And so it'll just make it a lot easier to understand whether you're in a hub zone or not. So that's basically all I have for today. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but I think we had some issues getting this started, so hopefully everybody got the information they needed. There are a couple of things I want to say here for additional resources. Contact SBA at HUBZone@sba.gov when you apply for a HUBZone status, and based on a location within the external boundaries, you know you're within the external boundaries of an Indian reservation, but the SBA HUBZone maps do not show that you're under, that you have qualified Indian land status. So if you believe that you are within Indian lands, but SBA doesn't show it on the maps, then contact us. You'll need to submit official documentation from the appropriate Bureau of Indian Affairs, Land Titles and Records Office, with jurisdiction over the firm area, confirming that it's located within the boundaries of the reservation, and then we can proceed. The other case is if you apply for HUBZone status based on a location within a base closure area, and again, this is base closed from 2005 forward, but the area is not listed as a base closure area on SBA's maps. So if you believe that you're within the boundaries of a base closure area, but SBA doesn't show it, then let us know. You will need to submit relevant documentation from the Department of Defense's Office of Economic Adjustment or the military department responsible for closing the installation. And if you want details and the regulatory authority behind all of this, the link is here. It's in 13 CFR 126.304, Part B and C. And then finally, if this is the same HUBZone resources that you look at for other places. If you need local assistance, the link is available. If you need to take a look at the HUBZone website for the latest information, including call-in instructions to the HUBZone office hours. HUBZone office hours occur between 2 and 3 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays and Thursdays. All of the call-in information is available on the HUBZone website there. And then finally, you can contact the help desk at HUBZone@sba.gov. And that's all I have for my presentation. Thank you all so much for attending. As a reminder, this webinar will be posted on YouTube, and all of the presentation slides will be available once the HUBZone webinar series is complete, and will be communications will be sent out through our normal channels. That's it. Thank you all for attending. Goodbye.
Thank you to our speaker, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. This call has concluded, and you may now disconnect.